A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 56, Vigil of the Lion. One night, under a quiet, unnaturally bright moon, Philip found himself drawn from the safety of the Macedonian tents. Antigonus, ever watchful, slipped out to join him, followed by the younger Pethan and Leonidas. They moved like shadows toward the distant, steady glow of the Theban command fire, a beacon of authority in the sprawling camp. Crouching behind a low rise, they watched the figures illuminated by the flickering light. Pelopidas sat with his back to the moon, hunched over a large map spread across a low table. He spoke in hushed, intense tones with Charon, another Theban commander, their voices low murmurs against the vast silence of the night. The silver moonlight and the warm firelight starkly illuminated the general's stern, chiseled profile. His face, etched with the lines of relentless purpose, betrayed no hint of weariness. He was a figure of unyielding focus, even in repose, his mind perpetually on the next strategic move, the next campaign, the next assertion of Theban power. A fresh surge of awe, tinged with a chilling intimidation, washed over Philip. This was not merely a general, this was a force of nature. The boys retreated silently into the shadows, but the image of Pelopidas's unwavering intensity burned into Philip's mind. The camp was a world of cold precision. Wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of the royal stables, Philip felt a creeping sense of unease. He was used to the vibrant, boisterous chaos of a Macedonian military camp, the smell of roasting boar, the drunken songs of his father's men, and the rough camaraderie that echoed through the hills. This was different. There was no laughter here, no wasted energy. The Theban camp functioned with the silent efficiency of a loom weaving a tapestry of war. In Pella, strength was measured by who could shout the loudest or strike the hardest in a drunken brawl. Here, strength was measured by silence and synchronization. Philip realized with a start that he was no longer a prince in a palace. He was a piece of cargo inside a grand, complex machine. To survive it, he couldn't just watch it, he had to understand its logic. The column moved south with a relentless mechanical rhythm. The camp was a world of cold precision, and Philip, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled of the royal stables, felt like a piece of cargo being transported in a grand machine. The day began not with a bugle, but with a whisper of movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Before the sun had even dared to sketch a line on the horizon, the Theban non-combatants were already active, their shadows darting between the tents. Philip watched from his pony as they handed out a simple breakfast of hardened bread and salted cheese, a stark contrast to the fresh fruit on warm porridge of the palace. The soldiers of the sacred band, with their polished bronze and grim faces, ate on the move. They swallowed their rations in silence as they broke camp with terrifying speed. There was no conversation, no laughter, only the rhythmic thrum of footfalls and the low groan of the supply wagons. "It's like they're not even men," muttered Antigonus, a keen-eyed boy of 12 beside him, who seemed to possess a perpetually furrowed brow. "See how they move. Like a single beast. 1,000 warriors, perhaps more. General Pelopidas seems to command them with a glance." "They fight as partners," Philip replied, his voice low. He had overheard the Macedonian caretakers talking about the elite heart of this army. "They say there are 300 of the sacred band. They train as pairs. They fight as one." The midday break was just as swift. The caravan halted for no more than an hour. The Theban soldiers chewed on preserved meat on hardtack, washing it down with a draught of diluted wine. Philip and the other boys were given a small cooked meal over a fire, a rare indulgence. But even this felt rushed, a brief interlude before the inexorable march continued. Philip slid the sika into the hidden seam of his tunic. The weight of the steel against his ribs felt like a secret promise. "I will learn their logic, mother," he whispered into the wind, his eyes hardening into the cold gray of winter. "I will use this blade to cut the strings they try to pull." The journey south truly began under a sky the color of bruised plums. By nightfall, the column reached the foothills of Mount Olympus, the jagged peaks looming like silent sentinels over the camp. While the other boys huddled in their tents, shivering from a mix of cold and homesickness, Philip slipped into the darkness. He followed the sound of rhythmic, melodic chanting and the sharp, repetitive crack of wood striking wood. He found them in a clearing, illuminated by the orange flicker of massive watchfires, the sacred band. They did not train in the chaotic, individual bouts Philip had seen in Pella. These men moved in pairs, fighting as if they shared a single soul. One man lunged while his partner covered his flank, their movements so synchronized they seemed to breathe in unison. Crouched behind a heavy supply wagon, Philip watched veteran hoplites drill with weighted spears. Their thrusts were surgical, aimed at the narrowest gaps in armor, the throat, the groin, and the inner thigh. "You're far from your blankets, little prince," Philip flinched. Pelopidas stood behind him, his massive shoulders bare and glistening in the firelight. He wasn't angry. He was watching his men with the quiet, paternal pride of a master craftsman. "In Macedon, we fight for glory," Philip whispered, still mesmerized by the drills. "Here, they fight as if they are protecting something more than their own lives." "They are," Pelopidas replied. "They are the 300 of Thebes. Each man fights for the life of the one beside him. In your kingdom, every noble wants to be the hero. Here, the unit is the hero. If the line fails, Thebes dies." Pelopidas pointed toward a pair of younger soldiers practicing a specific formation. "See how they stand? That is the embolon, the wedge. Most Greeks think the phalanx is a wall. We have learned it as a hammer. We shatter the enemy at a single point." Philip memorized the precise footwork and the grip on the shields. General Iphicrates had taught him the value of speed. Now, Pelopidas was teaching him the power of structure. "Will they teach me that?" Philip asked. The map table flickered under the dim, shifting glow of the oil lamp, casting long, bruised shadows across the walls of the command tent. Pelopidas looked down at the young prince standing before him, the firelight dancing in his dark, assessing eyes. "Epaminondas will teach you the philosophy of the spear," Pelopidas said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that commanded total silence. "My men will teach you the weight of it. Whether you can carry it, that is up to you." A philosophy of the spear, young Philip thought, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the heavy weight of the general's gaze. "They think me just another royal hostage to be molded in Boeotia. They do not yet know I am forged of harder iron than they suspect." Before Philip could frame his reply, the heavy leather flap of the tent violently tore open. A cold rush of midnight air swept inside, carrying the scent of dust and panic. A breathless, soot-stained merchant stumbled into the torchlight, his chest heaving as he dropped heavily to one knee. "General Pelopidas," the merchant gasped, his voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "We are attacked." "The tyrant Alexander of Ferry. His horsemen raided our advanced supply train. They took our food, smashed what they could not carry, and left us with nothing." Pelopidas did not flinch. He did not curse or slam his fist against the wood. He remained utterly, chillingly still, his mind racing through the tactical implications before the man had even finished catching his breath. Ferry's horsemen striking the advance lines so far north? Pelopidas calculated, his eyes narrowing. Alexander is probing our logistics, looking for the soft underbelly. "Did they kill any of the team?" Pelopidas asked, his voice deadpan and razor-sharp. "Or did they merely raid and disappear into the scrub?" "No, by the gods, we are all safe," the merchant stammered, wiping sweat and blood from his forehead. "They only harassed us, scattered the grain, and left a message. Thessaly does not bow to Boeotian chains." Half the team stayed behind to watch the smoldering camp and salvage what they could. The rest of us ran to find help. A slow, grim realization settled over Pelopidas's features. He let out a quiet breath, leaning his palms flat against the map table. "I'm glad nobody was hurt or killed," Pelopidas murmured, glancing around the tent. "The tyrant is cunning. Alexander knows that if he spills Theban blood, he triggers a total, unyielding war that his city-state cannot survive. This is not a battle of steel, it is psychological warfare. He wants to bleed our treasury, stretch our supply lines to breaking point, and starve our army from within before we ever reach the frontier." In the dim corner of the tent, young Philip stood entirely motionless. He said nothing, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes darting between the panicked merchant, the ruined crates described on the floor, and Pelopidas's calculated expression. He was soaking in every detail, storing the mechanics of psychological attrition away in his memory like a weapon. Pelopidas noticed the young hostage's unbroken silence. He turned his head slightly, fixing his gaze on the Macedonian prince. Philip, Pelopidas challenged, his tone dropping into a test of intellect and survival. You have listened to the panic and the strategy. What do you think of this situation? What is your response? If you were holding this command, what tactics would you use to answer the tyrant's game? The dim oil lamp flickered against the damp tent canvas as Philip stepped forward from the shadows, his youthful frame radiating a sharp, unyielding intensity that commanded the room. He tests me, Philip thought, his eyes locking onto Pelopidas with absolute focus. He wants to see if I'm just a cage prince or a commander who understands the brutal math of survival. If the merchants cannot secure emergency supplies from the local hamlets, we end up with empty bellies and a starving vanguard. Philip began, his voice steady and cutting through the heavy tension of the tent. And Alexander is not done. He will strike this route again, not to fight us, but to bleed us until our morale breaks entirely. Philip stepped closer to the map table, tracing a scarred finger down the trade corridor. How many days until our main reserves can catch up from the Cadmea? Philip asked, looking up at the general. We cannot wait blindly. We must send a heavily guarded relief caravan immediately, escorted by our best spearmen, to meet the stranded merchants halfway. While that rescue team moves up, the merchants must forage under the protection of a detached guard unit. And starting tonight, every man in this camp goes on strict half rations. We minimize food and water consumption to the absolute minimum to stretch every crumb. That is the only immediate defense I can think of. Philip paused, his jaw tightening as he looked at Pelopidas, waiting to see if his austere, desperate calculus hit its mark. Then his eyes narrowed with a darker, more aggressive gleam. But if you want another strategy beyond mere defense, Philip added, his tone dropping into a cold whisper, we do not just sit here, waiting for his next raid. Alexander thinks he can dictate the rhythm of this war from Ferry. We turn his own psychological game against him. We let him think our supply line is shattered and starving, leaving a calculated, tempting gap in our patrol. When his horsemen ride out for their next easy hit, we do not just defend the wagons, we spring an ambush in the narrow passes. We cut off his raiding party, slaughter his outriders, and send his own blood back to him in chains. Starvation is a war of patience, general, but a trap is won by the wolf who bites first. The crisp night air hit Philip like a splash of cold water as he stepped out from the heavy fabric of the general's tent and looked up at the vast, indifferent expanse of the starlit sky. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the chill clear the heavy scent of burning wool and sweat from his lungs. Running a military campaign, dealing with ruthless tyrants like Alexander, dodging usurpers, and being constantly cornered by the snapping teeth of regional vultures, it was an endless, grinding trial. He began to wonder about the true nature of power. Protecting a kingdom, managing the supreme military might of Thebes, holding together sprawling alliances, it was an endless pursuit that no single man could ever shoulder alone. It required capable hands and brilliant strategic minds working in absolute unison. Philip was finally beginning to understand the unspoken synergy between Pelopidas, Epaminondas, and their close general, Pamines. A one-man operation was destined to fail. The key to survival and dominance was finding how to make others stand and think on the same page, sharing the exact same vision. If a state remained internally divided or at war with itself, it would inevitably crumble. Lost in these heavy thoughts, Philip started walking back through the shadows toward his quarters. Clack! A footstep, strangely slow and quiet, gliding through the darkness with deliberate stealth, desperate to avoid detection. Philip's internal senses snapped to high alert, his muscles tightening instantly. A spy? Or an assassin? In the span of a heartbeat, his mind began to calculate the threat with ruthless precision. If this shadow is an assassin or a scout, what is his trajectory? What does he actually want? Me? A Macedonian hostage to use as leverage? An ambush like the Illyrians pull in night camps? Another layer of psychological warfare to terrify the vanguard? Or perhaps a high-value capture, me or one of my companions to trade for gold or political concessions? Food stores are useless to a killer. Is he here to assassinate Pelopidas to decapitate the command? Or am I just letting exhaustion make me paranoid? Out of the corner of his eye, Philip caught the faint flicker of a shadow darting swiftly between the supply crates. Let's test him, Philip decided. He abruptly turned his path and began walking back toward the general's tent to see if the shadow would track his movement. If I am the primary target, he will stalk me, moving to seize the first isolated moment to snatch me. But if his plan is a wider campfire ambush, it is still too early and too quiet. Professional killers wait until the entire camp falls into deep slumber. His hand slid down his side, his fingers wrapping firmly around the cold, familiar hilt of the blade his mother had given him. He walked deliberately toward the perimeter of the general's tent, curving his steps just outside the reach of the nearest campfire, so that his illuminated silhouette cast a sharp, moving shadow against the thick canvas walls. It was a calculated trap, a deliberate lure to draw the intruder out into the open. His mind was already coiled to strike, blade drawn and ready. Suddenly, a heavy weight slammed into him from behind. A pair of powerful arms locked around his throat and torso, dragging him backward into the dark. Philip did not flinch. Drawing on pure, cold instinct, he twisted his body, drove the blade upward with savage force into his assailant's stomach, and screamed at the top of his lungs into the night. "General!" The news of the Macedonian exodus did not reach Olympia as a dispatch of war, but as a tremor of unease beneath the sacred soil. Within the Prytaneum, the heart of the sanctuary, where the eternal flame was tended by the fingers of perpetual devotion, the high officials and the overseers of the games received the encrypted scrolls from their observers in the northern passes. The atmosphere in the sanctuary was heavy with a different kind of tension, one steeped in centuries of tradition, political paranoia, and divine observation. Here, surrounded by the towering gold and ivory statues of gods, and the silent marble memory of past Olympic champions who had long since turned to dust, the intelligence was viewed through the lens of ancient, cyclical dread. "Thebes has gathered the future of the North," the chief overseer whispered, his voice hushed in the presence of the flickering flame. He unrolled the stiff papyrus, his callous fingers tracing the heavy clay seal of the Theban command. 70 scions of the Argead nobility. The boy, Philip, at their head. They are being led into the Cadmea not as ambassadors, but as livestock walking willingly toward a sacrificial altar. A younger priest, his face pale as the altar stone, looked out through the marble columns toward the shadowed stadium grounds. The balance of Hellas is fundamentally broken. If Thebes tames the Macedonian bloodline, the Olympic Games will no longer be a sacred contest of free city-states. They will be an annual demonstration of absolute Theban dominance. They will use the boy to win the favor of the gods, and if they win the sanction of Olympus, who among us will dare challenge their hegemony? The overseer felt a cold, intuitive shiver race down his spine. They are blind, he thought bitterly, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the dancing flames. They do not understand that the gods care little for the political survival of cities or the vanity of mortals. The gods only care for the spectacle, the rise, the hubris, and the inevitable catastrophic fall. His tutelage in Thebes is merely the opening act of a divine tragedy, not a coronation. Olympia is the spiritual crown jewel of the world, and now the wolves are gathering at its borders to see who will be the first to claim it by force. "Watch them," the overseer commanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register that brooked no argument. "When these boys return to the north, they will not come as humble pilgrims seeking an olive wreath. They will come as conquerors. If Philip survives the crushing cage of Thebes, the next time he arrives at our gates, it will not be to compete for glory. It will be to dictate who controls the sacred ground itself." "Should we send warning to Sparta?" the priest asked, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his ceremonial robes. "Or dispatch an emissary to the Athenians before it is too late?" "No," the overseer replied, his voice chilling the air between them like a winter wind off Mount Cronus. "Let the southern democracy scramble. Let them wallow in their self-righteous fear. Olympia has seen empires rise and fall like the coastal tide, and we have outlived them all. If the north is to burn, let it burn. We will remain here at the navel of the world, and we will watch as the war dance of the Macedonians inevitably finds its way to our altar." The gods demand a victim to balance the scales, the overseer thought, watching the distorted shadows dance against the impassive faces of the statues. And it seems the boy in Thebes is currently walking straight toward the blade, entirely unaware that he is sharpening it with every breath he takes. To be continued in episode 56-2, Shadows of the Piraeus. A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 15 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist and Divine Oracle playlist. Join the vanguard. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.